Next on Link TV, Latin Pulse, news and analysis from Latin America as seen by Latin American media, followed by a panel discussion on the issues. Next on Latin Pulse, only on Link TV.
The following program is an original production of Link TV.
Earth can't sustain life without it, yet water seems to be taken for granted. Latin America, with its glaciers and the Amazon basin, has one of the biggest sources of fresh water in the world. Yet drinking water is scarce, and for some, it's even a luxury. Will there be a battle for fresh water in the future? And if it runs out, what other alternatives are there? This and more coming up next on Latin Pulse. Hello and welcome to Pulso Latino. I'm your host, Ana Cuevas. Our topic tonight, fresh water and what could happen if we run out. It's been said water is the oil of the future. It's a natural resource we can't live without. But unlike oil, there are no known alternatives to fresh drinking water. Latin America has some of the biggest sources of fresh water in the world. It has the Andes Mountains, the Amazon River, and glaciers. Yet some of those glaciers are melting at an alarming rate, as we see in the following report from Spain's Televisión Española.
Se trata del glaciar San Rafael, en la Patagonia chilena. Considerado Patrimonio de la Humanidad y Reserva de la Biosfera por la UNESCO, pierde hielo a un ritmo alarmante. Lo que vemos es solo la lengua. Desciende desde una altura de más de 4.000 metros hasta esta laguna a nivel del mar. Hoy es uno de los principales destinos turísticos de Chile y los que trabajan en la zona son testigos de lo que está pasando.
Cuando yo llegué aquí hace 6 años atrás, tenía una altura entre 70 a 100 metros. Hoy día tiene una altura de 50 a 60 metros.
Además, está documentado que a finales del siglo XIX el glaciar se extendía 10 kilómetros más por la laguna. Ahora en claro retroceso, precisamente cuando se ha convertido en atractivo para el turismo en una región casi deshabitada.
In Central America, the lack of drinking water, together with pollution, are having a huge impact on people's health, the economy, and even the war on poverty. This angle we get from El Salvador's Hechos newscast.
La cantidad de agua en el país se ha reducido sustancialmente en los últimos años mientras la demanda se incrementa. La calidad del recurso también ha sido severamente afectada por la contaminación y los efectos en la salud.
El acceso a servicios adecuados de agua potable y de saneamiento son claves para el crecimiento económico del país y para la reducción de la pobreza.
El Servicio Nacional de Estudios Territoriales ha comprobado que solo el 20% de las aguas superficiales del país es apta para ser potabilizada.
Hay un índice incluso básico, que es el índice coliforme, sobre el cual agua que no cumpla con ese requisito no debería de ser entregada a la población para su consumo. Podría ser utilizada en cualquier otro tipo de situación, lavar ropa, etcétera, pero no para consumo.
Cada año en América Latina y el Caribe mueren cerca de 77.000 niños por enfermedades diarreicas, según la Organización Panamericana de la Salud.
In Mexico, fresh water for one of its main urban centers and surrounding farms has been rendered useless by industry, pollution, and waste. Televisión Española reports tourism and agriculture are also victims in this case.
Esta catarata fue durante años el orgullo de la ciudad del Salto. Hoy es un lugar del que se avergüenzan la mayoría de sus 120.000 habitantes.
Empezó a aumentar el ser humano y a crearse necesidades. Lo primero que se empezó a echar a perder fue el agua.
Toda esta espuma esconde los residuos industriales de más de 200 fábricas y parte de los desechos domésticos que le llegan de Guadalajara.
A esta imagen le falta el olor, que es insoportable. Esta catarata, que figura en las guías como un atractivo turístico, vierte 20.000 litros de agua por segundo. Agua completamente contaminada.
Plomo, mercurio, ácido sulfídrico son algunos de los componentes que transporta el río Santiago.
Con agua del río Santiago la gente produce hortaliza, que luego se las llevamos al mercado de allá de Abastos.
A escasos kilómetros del río está este basurero, que no ha dejado ni un solo pozo de agua sano a su alrededor.
These issues with pollution and shortages are bringing awareness about recycling and water purification. Once Noticias reports Mexican scientists are tapping into the past. They're using indigenous technology to recapture and recycle.
En México, solo 23% de las aguas residuales son tratadas. Para resolver este problema, científicos mexicanos aprovechan una técnica prehispánica. Mediante humedales artificiales o pequeñas porciones de tierra a orillas de los canales de Xochimilco y Cuemanco, logran capturar los contaminantes. En los humedales prehispánicos, a través de microorganismos sembrados en el suelo, se degrada la materia orgánica y los metales del agua.
¿Qué tipo de contaminantes? Materia carbonosa, es decir, materia orgánica, algunos metales pesados, nitrógeno en sus distintas formas.
A un año de su empleo en Xochimilco, el sistema ha demostrado que las aguas se pueden purificar para obtener más rendimiento en los cultivos de hortaliza, sin afectar a la fauna endémica como el ajolote mexicano.
There are also renewed efforts to conserve water, and Chile has come up with some innovative ways, as we see in the following report from Tele 13.
Es uno de los primeros actos que hacemos todos los días. El problema es que estamos semidormidos y además con los ojos cerrados y por eso perdemos la noción del tiempo. Una ducha ocupa en promedio 100 litros de agua cada 5 minutos, por lo que si nos quedamos solo 2 minutos más, ya estaremos gastando 40 litros adicionales a lo que hay que sumarle el gas para calentarlos. Ante esto, los expertos recomiendan poner relojes en las duchas para al menos no perder la noción del tiempo y de paso valiosos pesos. Es parte de la nueva conciencia del chileno de ahorro de energía. Lo mismo que hace la ducha eficiente de última generación.
Son duchas aireadas, con inyección de aire, y eso hace una mezcla tipo chorro, tipo jacuzzi, que al final es muy agradable bañarse en esto.
Lo más agradable es el ahorro. Si bien la inversión sale 40.000 pesos, gasta cerca de 125 pesos menos por cada duchazo, casi 4.000 al mes y 45.000 pesos al año por cada integrante de la familia. Si une esto al ahorro del reloj de baño, le podemos asegurar que su día comenzará más alegre que hasta ahora.
The president of the Ecuadorian Citizens Committee for Public Services, César Cárdenas, was in the U.S. recently. He was lobbying against the privatization of water services. We caught up with him in San Francisco, California, where we spoke to him about this issue.
Bueno, lamentablemente la privatización le priva a los más pobres de tener acceso al agua y eso es algo nefasto para la vida misma, no solamente de las poblaciones que vivimos en los sectores urbanos en las ciudades, sino también en los sectores rurales, en el campo, donde las políticas de privatización van a afectar y van a tener un impacto inclusive sobre la agricultura, sobre la pequeña agricultura, y eso no puede continuar. Es insostenible la privatización del agua, además de eso también es insostenible la privatización de los servicios porque tiene una serie de problemas, de limitaciones, como por ejemplo que las empresas cometen una serie de violaciones a los derechos humanos, a los principios constitucionales y a las leyes, inclusive en cada país, como en el caso nuestro, de Interagua, que es una subsidiaria de Bechtel en Guayaquil, que comete una serie de violaciones y abusos a los usuarios, a los ciudadanos de Guayaquil.
In our studios to talk about water, or the lack of, we have Snitow, filmmaker and producer of the documentary Thirst and its follow-up book of the same name. And from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Winona Howder, Executive Director of Food and Water Watch, and Abel Mejia, Corporations Project Manager at the World Bank. Mr. Mejia, let's start with you. Is there a benefit to a private water supply industry versus something that's run by the government?
Well, let me rephrase the question. The provision of services is a public obligation that you can do that through different options that can be public or private. So there are different models that can be applied. In some places, the public model is working very, very well. In some other areas and some other countries, it's a private operation of services. In big cities and in small towns, is working well.
Mr. Snitow, the same question. Do you see any advantages or disadvantages to the private run versus one that's run by the government?
There are a lot of disadvantages when it comes to private provision of services. First of all, water is got to be a basic obligation of government. And so when you privatize it, you suddenly create a situation in which there are people making profit off water, where poor people are not a profitable group of people to be delivering that service for, where you have disincentives for exactly the kind of behavior that you need to have to deliver a basic human right. And so there's one of the things that we talk about in our movie and in our book is that the key element of what's going on when you have privatization is a failure. And it's a failure that's not only of government, but it's a failure of the international system which needs to provide enough resources for local people to have that human right to water.
Ms. Houter, what role does industry or any kind of lack of regulation have in the water supply in Latin America?
Well, we think that the whole development model is wrong, and when you drive people off of the land by policies that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have initiated, and expect people who are living in shanty towns to have access to water, and then force privatization that's not regulated, what you have is a disaster. And across Latin America, we've seen failure after failure, whether it's in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, whether it's La Paz, Bolivia, Guayaquil, Ecuador. You see higher rates, you see lack of good service, you see massive environmental damage, you see illness from cholera and hepatitis and other diseases. And unfortunately, here in the U.S., which is highly regulated, we have the same problems with privatization because the private companies usually cut staff to achieve their efficiency, and regulation hasn't been able to take care of the problems that occur: high prices, poor service, and environmental problems.
But to be fair, historically in Latin America, the governments have been the ones who've had to provide water, and the system still wasn't working.
Right. There have been problems with public services, so what we need to do is have enough funding and have the same expectation for Latin America that we've had for the U.S. In the U.S., we didn't expect poor people who make $1 or $2 a day to pay for public services. The U.S. made a public policy decision at the turn of the 20th century to provide potable water, and sufficient funding was made available, and then there was an engaged citizenry. And so we need to deal with the problems of corruption and lack of funding, not privatize these systems.
Yeah, I'd like to add something on that. Latin America and Central American experience has really led the way. It was really the first place to experiment on World Bank and International Monetary Fund models that really followed the very conservative trends in the United States, where you cut public services, you turn over everything from tin mines to water services to private companies, and then you say that those companies should make a profit and then that will improve the services and make things good. And what we saw was enormous disasters. Argentina, hyperinflation. Brazil, in Chile, we've seen dictatorships impose these kind of policies. So it was very anti-democratic. And what's happened is that Latin America is now leading the way because you've had popular grassroots movements saying, we want to take back our water services, we want to take back our rights and our resources, and we're going to actually have to change our government to do it. So it's a broad movement to not only kick out the private companies, but also to change the governments. And we've seen an extraordinary transformation across South America in just the last 5 or 10 years.
Mr. Mejia, why do you think there's been that kind of a difficulty when it comes to the privatization of the water services in Latin America?
Well, as I said before, it's privatization or participation of the private sector in the provision of water supply and sanitation services that they can take many different forms and options. Just to give you an indication, there are already, at this point of time, like 170 million people in the world, in the developing world, receiving services in one way or another from public-private partnerships. In Latin America, we have very good public company providing services, but also private in Mexico, in Cuba, in Santiago de Cuba, in Central America, in some places, in Colombia, in big cities and small towns and very poor neighborhoods, in Guayaquil. There are a few failures. It's well-known failures in Bolivia, in other places. But overall, I think it's a model that is very viable. Chile, in particular, has improved services enormously. It is one of the countries that is reaching 100% wastewater treatment ahead of many other countries in the developed world. So I think this is a debate that has become very ideologically, but not sufficiently based on the facts. I think the position that we at the bank has is that this is essentially public service, but there is an option that this provision can be done by the private sector.
Mr. Snitow, you did a documentary called Thirst, and we're talking about water as a natural resource. Is it something where, can we really run out of water?
Well, it's not possible really for us to run out of water because we will run out of life if that were to happen. So the question is, how is water distributed? Who has the power to be able to decide where the resources go and how much people pay for them? And since it's so basic, it has to be something that's basically a democratic decision. You know, when I traveled around the world on covering water issues, we found constantly people who were running water systems who were stunned to hear that the United States has a public water system, because the United States is imposing an ideological privatization system abroad where we have a strong public system at home.
Ms. Howder, with this new, you mentioned the new world of globalization, how does this affect people living in the United States when you hear that there are issues with water supplies in Latin America?
Well, I think that one of the ways that it affects people is that we're talking about many of the same companies. In the case of a city like Guayaquil, Ecuador, it was a San Francisco company called Bechtel, and many water activists have tried to put pressure on Bechtel because Guayaquil is one of the examples of a major failure of privatization, where there's a contract that the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, which is another international finance institution that makes lots of loans in Latin America, they forced the country to privatize. There's a 30-year contract. Bechtel is supposed to give $500 million in investment and add 55,000 new customers to connected water services. And Bechtel is completely unable to live up to the contract. They dump all but 5% of the sewage goes into local waterways. Children, 150 children in the vicinity get hepatitis from the water. None of the investment is made. And this is one of the places that the World Bank points to as being a success story. And we know that this isn't true, and that activists in the United States are helping to follow this and to look at the World Bank loans and to get that information to people in Latin America. We did a study of World Bank loans in the 1990s and found that 90% require privatization and user fees. And before the privatization takes place, what you see is that the public service is often defunded. And this has happened around the world. So this helps make the public system less efficient and causes lots of problems. And it's actually these international finance institutions that are being ideological. First of all, they force the country to put most of their resources into paying off the interest on their loans, so the country doesn't have the money to actually fix their water system. What we say is we need a new development model that helps people, that provides water, that provides basic services, and we need to stop this ideologically driven policy of our government and the World Bank of using an institution like this to find business opportunities in other parts of the world.
I also want to remind our viewers that we did invite a representative of Bechtel to be with us today, and they declined our invitation for an interview. Mr. Mejia, if you would like to address the issue, do you believe that there is a way to create some sort of a combination between the loans provided by the World Bank, working in conjunction with the governments in Latin America to make the system a lot more efficient?
Absolutely. This is exactly what's going on. It's, as I said before, there is a tremendous progress all over Latin America over the past 20, 25, 30 years in the provision of water supply and sanitation services. One indication is the protection that is being provided today by regulatory agencies in all the countries of Latin America. 80% of the urban population is protected by regulation that protect the consumers, that defines efficiency and performance parameters for the companies. In the case of Guayaquil, that I know well, I have worked on that city for the last 30 years. Over the past years, 500,000 people have received services that they received before, not only in water supply and sanitation, but also in drainage. This is a very successful operation. There are others that are not that successful, but this in particular is extremely good. It's performing well. There are others in Colombia, for instance. In very small and very poor towns, the government is providing capital subsidies to do investments, and much of these operations are run by local private operators, and is a tremendous success, that is being replicated in many other parts of the world.
The School of Communications at the University of Miami recently produced a compelling documentary called One Water. Here is a clip of that production.
As cities grow, new entrants from the countryside create peri-urban areas that lack adequate services, and that before those people actually have access to formal pipe services, they generally pay on the order of 10 times the cost for water.
On the phone from Atlanta, Georgia, we have Gonzalo Mejía, producer and director of this documentary. Señor Mejía, gracias por estar con nosotros y bienvenidos a Pulso Latino. ¿Usted qué determinó en cuanto a cuál ha sido la efectividad de la privatización versus proveer el agua como un servicio público?
Lo que nosotros pudimos ver como documentaristas, al trabajar en Guayaquil específicamente con la compañía que se llama Interagua. Bechtel es dueño de Interagua. Firmado una concesión por un periodo largo, 30 años o algo así. Y desde nuestro punto de vista, ellos han logrado cumplir muy bien todas las metas que le prometieron a ECAPAC, que es la compañía del gobierno que regula todos los temas del agua en el Ecuador.
Sin embargo, existen muchas críticas acerca de la manera en que Bechtel ha funcionado y argumentan de que todas las metas no se llegaron a cumplir y que aún hay escasez de agua. Claro,
yo entiendo, lo que no sé cuáles fueron las limitantes de tiempo que le han dado a Interagua para cumplir las metas. Lo que yo tengo entendido hasta cuando hicimos el documental es que ellos habían excedido las expectativas y habían llegado a las metas cumplidas mucho antes de la fecha que habían fijado, porque entiendo que les ponían de meta cumplir el proveer de agua a, por ejemplo, una zona que se llama la Isla Trinitaria, y ellos terminaron el proyecto, que es un proyecto modelo, lo terminaron mucho antes de lo que ellos habían previsto.
Pero al privatizar el servicio de agua aumenta obviamente el precio. ¿Qué sucede con aquellas personas que no pueden pagar el nuevo precio del agua?
Bueno, es muy interesante que sacas este tema. En el caso de la Isla Trinitaria, que es un ejemplo modelo para Latinoamérica y tal vez para el mundo, las familias que viven en esta comunidad muy humilde terminan pagando mucho menos de lo que pagaban antes.
¿De alguna manera lo subsidia entonces el gobierno?
No. Es simplemente que la distribución es mucho más eficiente. Ellos antes utilizaban tanqueros de agua. Entonces pagaban $1, el equivalente a $1 por tanque. y utilizaban un tanque diario. Entonces, quiere decir que pagan $30 de agua en un mes, más o menos. Ahora con este sistema nuevo que ellos hicieron, que brindan por agua por tuberías y hacen algo que se llama piletas comunitarias, que quiere decir que es un medidor, y este medidor provee de agua a varias familias, puede ser a 12 familias o algo así, y estas 12 familias pagan la cuenta de agua al final del mes, entre todos ellos. Entonces, esta cuenta de agua puede que sea $30 entre todas las familias. Entonces, una diferencia increíble, abismal. Las familias terminan pagando $2 o $3 mensuales de agua, a diferencia de lo que pagan antes, que pagan 30.
En el caso de Ecuador, que es muy similar a lo que sucede en el resto de América Latina, ¿cuál es el problema principal en cuanto a la distribución del agua? ¿Tiene que ver con el gobierno, infraestructura? ¿Dónde está el problema?
Mucho, lo que nosotros pudimos ver en Guayaquil es infraestructura y logística, porque es muy difícil lograr proveer de agua a las zonas que están invadidas por gente que viene a la ciudad del campo. Entonces, esa gente que sigue siendo proveída de agua por tanquero, tengo entendido que ellos a algún momento les van a ofrecer agua, tal vez utilizando este modelo que se usó en la isla Trinitaria.
Es una situación difícil, ya que de por sí no existe infraestructura en el área donde las personas están viviendo.
Exactamente, porque son zonas rurales que han sido invadidas, donde han construido casas y no hay calles ni alcantarillado, zonas que no están desarrolladas de ninguna manera. Normalmente electricidad es una de las primeras cosas que consiguen, pero el agua y el alcantarillado es muy difícil.
Muchísimas gracias, señor Gonzalo Mejía, productor y director del documental One Water. Gracias por estar con nosotros en Pulso Latino.
Ok, Ana, mucho gusto.
I trust you enjoyed today's program. I'd like to thank our guest here in San Francisco, Alan Snitow, filmmaker and producer of the documentary Thirst and its follow-up book of the same name. If you want more information about this documentary and the book, log on to www.thirstthemovie.org. In Washington, D.C., Winona Houter, Executive Director of Food and Water Watch, and Abel Mejia, Corporation's Project Manager at the World Bank, and producer Gonzalo Mejia in Atlanta, Georgia. I also want to thank you at home or on the web for joining us today. We also want to thank American University in Washington, D.C. for their support in the production of this program. Join us next time when we take a closer look at Latin America through the eyes of Latin American media. To learn more about Pulso Latino and Latin America, log on to linktv.org. I'm Ana Cuevas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time here on Latin Pulse.
Latin Pulse was made possible by support from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Pulso Latino es posible gracias al apoyo de John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation y el William and Flora Hewlett Foundation.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs that connect you to the world.